This story is written by Daria Vasileva, also known as U/Peculidar. I'm a criminal profiler and a deceased serial killer is trying to murder me in the woods surrounding Fever Cabin, part number 3. It was growing light outside the cabin. I hadn't slept and I didn't need to. No hunger, no need to use the bathroom. I stared at the time on my laptop, realizing it was stuck on 5 p.m. of the day my wife and I arrived at the cabin. If I was to guess, that was around the same time we saw the man without a tongue. I shut the laptop and put it away. I was now armed with information, but little else. My mind hummed with the realization that fake Officer Bullock was actually the spirit of Henry Briarwood, a very dangerous man I helped put behind bars. The fact that he was just one of hundreds I had testified against chilled me to the bone. How many had ended their lives in jail cells or died in prison fights? Were their nefarious manifestations also dwelling in the woods outside Fever Cabin, just waiting for me to come out? Both of Briarwood's disguised appearances made sense now. On the first day he had tried to lead me away to a non-existent patrol car, and on the second he had hoped I would chase him out of the cabin, demanding to know where he had taken Camilla. He definitely wanted me out in those woods. I wasn't sure if it was really Camilla I had heard screaming in the woods, or yet another ploy. In any case, I didn't have time for theories. I needed to find my wife, and to do this I had to leave the safety of the cabin and face whoever, or whatever, was waiting for me in those woods. I did something then that I can't quite explain. A purely intuitive action performed with no real thought behind it. I went over to my Uncle Johnny's closet, which Camilla had not yet utilized, and began sorting through my dead uncle's clothes. His 80-year-old self was a much heavier man with a much simpler sense of fashion than the cerebral Uncle Johnny from the woods. Finally, I found it. The worn, patchy denim jacket my uncle had worn during those summers I had come to stay with him. He always put it on when going out into the woods, even on the hottest days. The denim had grown soft over the years, and I was careful to put the jacket on without ripping it. I walked over to the mirror and noticed a faint purple glow radiating from the fabric. Somehow that made sense in this bizarre other world. I couldn't stay in my safe spot, but I could bring a totem with me when I went looking for Camilla. I scavenged the cabin for more useful supplies or weapons, finding one of my uncle's rusty old folding knives and a wind-up flashlight. I was really hoping to find a compass, but there weren't any in sight. Perhaps things like time and direction just didn't matter here. Maybe if you just walked long and far enough, you'd get where you needed to go. With these thoughts in mind, I stepped outside into the bright daylight. I worked on winding the flashlight as I walked towards the woods. If time kept hopping around the way it had before, nightfall would come sooner than later. I held my breath upon crossing the threshold of the forest, half expecting to see something or someone lurking about. Maybe more of my childhood phobias would pop up, I thought, shuddering at the thought of a murderous clown stalking me through the woods. Nothing of the sort happened. The woods were as I'd always known them as a boy, tall, dark, and mysterious. The sounds of fluttering leaves and birds chirping lulled my anxieties, but only a little. As I walked on, my thoughts were on the Briarwood case from 2 years ago. I would never forget the violent jolt of sitting down at my desk and seeing Camilla's face staring back at me from the fat case file on my desk. That raw stab of fear still burns in my memory. The terrifying flutter of what if? The girl in the photo had not been my wife, but a local student by the name of Katie Reeder, a beautiful, talented young woman who was finishing up a degree in wildlife conservation when she first went missing from a campsite not far from these woods. Local news had lapped up the story, and I felt uneasy seeing Katie's picture in my newsfeed during those first couple of weeks she went missing. The resemblance was uncanny. The same light, wavy hair as Camilla's, those blue eyes, always slightly doe-eyed with wonder. Faint crow's feet hinting at a life spent smiling and laughing. It made me sick when they discovered Katie's nude, mutilated body hoisted up in a tree with cheap handcuffs, a blood-stained machete wedged into a patch of trunk below her dangling feet. Katie was the second victim to be disposed of in this signature manner, and the behavioral science guys were brought in to draft a profile of the unsub. As always, there were so many creeps that fit the bill. The police felt overwhelmed trying to figure out exactly which prior sex offender, stalker, or jealous ex actually committed the crime. They had narrowed it down to 3 guys, and Henry Briarwood was the last of the interviews. I was positive he could be the perpetrator the moment I saw him. The other 2 men had been timid, fidgety, and ultimately ashamed of the prior convictions that landed them on the suspect list. Briarwood was the essence of cool as he talked about himself with unrestrained delight. After learning all I could about his background, domineering mother, absentee father figure, problems maintaining a healthy relationship with women, etc., I got him talking about the crimes. "Have you been following the machete killer case?" I had asked in my most dismissive tone. I needed Briarwood to think I was just going through the motions, to feel slighted at my ambivalence to his performance as a killer. I baited the very core of his narcissism, secretly registering every twitch, every stir of body language. "Well, it's hard to miss it. It's on the news and everything. Nothing like that ever happens around here," he said, trying to read my face. "Those poor girls, you know?" "Mm-hmm," I nodded, taking out my phone, pretending to answer a text. "Don't know why they brought me in, though," Briarwood offered, growing visibly tense. He had enjoyed the first half of the interview more. Talking about his background had made him feel important. "Oh, you know, routine checkup stuff," I replied, my eyes still glued to the phone. "It's very gruesome slitting their throats like that and all," he half mumbled to himself. After a few more questions, I had bid Henry Briarwood goodbye, allowing the interrogation team to take over. They got plenty of useful information out of him, but that wasn't my job. Popular books and movies have always depicted my career as this all-encompassing obsession with serial killers, but in the truth, I was mostly an analyst. I learned everything I could about the unsub, running it through an internal database of 100 similar cases. When I showed up in court for the Briarwood case, they asked me only one question. Did the defendant fit the profile? Henry Briarwood fit the profile to a T, and 2 years ago I let the court know it. A couple of days after the conviction, he hung himself in his prison cell. Predictably, the woods grew darker the further I walked. As I squeezed through a narrow path in the thicket of birches, all around me the sounds of nature began to die down. Soon I was walking in silence, listening to my hammering heart and uneven footfall. I took this to mean that I was getting far enough from my safe spot for enemies to start trying their luck, and slowed my pace to a halt in a small clearing. "Camilla?" I called out into the forest, flinching at the haunting echo that ran through the stillness. "Camilla!" I cried out again, louder this time. "Why did you betray me?" a voice whispered in my ear, and I jumped forward, spinning around to see my wife's naked corpse staring at me with tears in her eyes. "Camilla," I gasped. "Oh God, no, no, no!" I cried, gripping my head, the sight of my wife's swollen, decomposing flesh. She was all black and blue now, her limbs covered in bruises and cuts, a pair of handcuffs hanging off her left wrist. There was a deep horizontal gash in her throat, with streaks of dried blood running down to her chest and stomach. "I cannot rest," she said. "Because of you. I cannot rest." After a double take, I realized that it wasn't actually my wife. The resemblance was striking, but as the initial shock wore off, I was able to spot the slight difference in chin, nose length, and ear shape. The eyes, though, those deep pools of sky, were next to identical. I was about to respond when another voice whispered in my ear. "We cannot rest. Because of you, we are trapped here." Horrified, I staggered back to see another light-haired dead woman beside me. She was beaten so badly that both her eyes were swollen shut. "We want to rest," a new voice. A different dead girl had stepped into the clearing, her nude body a canvas splattered with torture and pain. More and more deceased women stepped out of the woods, chanting variations of "It's your fault" and "Let us rest" at me. A dozen corpses that looked like my missing wife encircled me. Some were in the earlier stages of decomposition. Others had already lost parts of their skin. One victim was almost entirely skeletal, with maggots swarming the crevices of her skull. The victims of Henry Briarwood. Katie Reeder, I croaked, turning back to the first girl who continued staring at me with Camilla's sad blue eyes. I am so sorry. Katie's expression was vacant as she approached me, bringing her hands up to my neck, clasping it gently. The other victims followed suit, and soon I was completely enveloped by dead women gripping at my neck, shoulders, and wrists. Their touch was cold and devastating. I felt all of it then. Every single one of their death experiences. The shock, the horror, the desperate will to survive their intimate deaths. The stabbing pain of every bruise and cut. Their thoughts were the worst. My mind spun with flashes of mothers, fathers, friends, and pets. Katie's last dying thought had been that she had not called her mother enough. "He drugged me and took me to a shed not far from here," Katie spoke, her broken gaze locked on mine. "He waited for me to wake up before he started. I was so scared." Oh God. I swallowed as countless ice fingers strengthened their grasp on me. One of the girls began tugging on the sleeves of Uncle Johnny's old jacket. I knew I had to resist, push them away, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from Katie. She moved in close enough for me to smell the earthy stench of death on her breath. He never said a word. I cried and screamed and cursed and tried to kick him, but the restraints were too tight. Then he brought out the knives and I fell silent. More hands were pulling at my jacket now, desperately trying to claw it off my back. I held onto it with both hands, elbowing some of the victims who had begun moaning as they drew in closer. Suddenly, Katie's grip on my throat tightened, a menacing snarl contorting her features. "You are the reason we're trapped here, reliving horrors of these woods every single day. We cannot sleep. We cannot rest. We are trapped in our living nightmares, beaten, killed, and hung from trees over and over and over." I tried to say something, but Katie's chokehold was tighter than a noose. For the second time since arriving in Fever Cabin, I was dying from asphyxiation. I had to act fast. I pulled my uncle's old folding knife from my pocket, closing my eyes before I jabbed it inside Katie's stomach. I opened them once she loosened her hold on my neck. It was the leeches all over again. The moment the blade pierced the skin, the apparition began screaming as purple flames enveloped her body. I watched the once beautiful face of Katie Reeder turn to charcoal. The other corpses kept coming, clawing at my neck. Their eyes were feral, faces contorted, bodies capable of remarkable strength. I went into a panicked frenzy, slashing the knife left and right in an attempt to defend myself. The screeches were deafening as one by one the victims of Henry Briarwood lunged at me, impaling themselves on the knife blade and combusting in purple flames. When the last of them burned up, I fell to the ground, my body convulsing in sobs as I ran my hands through Katie's pile of ashes. I had not wanted to inflict any more pain on those girls, every one of them a life stolen away. "It's good to see you actually have a conscience." Briarwood stepped into the clearing. He was no longer wearing the ludicrous disguise and was dressed simply in a gray sweater and jeans. "You fucking monster!" I screamed at him, jumping to my feet with my knife at the ready. "That knife won't do much against me, Paul. I'm already dead, remember?" He laughed. "I'm not even here to hurt you. Just need you to understand some things." "What have you done with Camilla?" I demanded, desperate for some sort of hint at my wife's whereabouts. "Funny you should mention her," Briarwood grinned, raising a patch of legal pad pages, Ran into her earlier and she asked me to pass these along. He walked up to me and placed the pages in my hand. You should probably go back to the cabin for now, Paul. Don't want to try your luck in these parts twice in one night. What do you want from me? I cried in exasperation as Henry Briarwood turned to walk away. Look over my case again, he replied, throwing me a final glance. You talked to me for 20 minutes, Paul. Is that really long enough to get to know somebody? With that, Briarwood disappeared into the woods. I considered chasing after him, but for the first time since sleeping 2 nights ago, I felt exhausted. Was there a hidden logic behind this as well? Did I need to be near the cabin to recharge? Uncle Johnny's jacket glowed brightly as night descended on the silent woods. I sat down on a tree stump in the clearing, trying to gather my thoughts. Shadows creeped the forest floor as tree branches swayed in the silent wind. With bated breath, I waited for whatever came next. I would face another 1,000 corpses and swim in a pool of leeches if it meant I could get my wife back. Camilla. I looked down at my shaking fist to see that I was clenching the sheets of paper Briarwood had given me. The torch was lying on the ground not far from my feet. Picking it up, I wound up the lever and turned it on. Relief hit me like a rain shower after a hot summer's day. It was a letter in Camilla's handwriting. She's alive, I whispered into the dead of night, holding the papers to my chest. I'm a criminal profiler, and my wife's letter has me questioning the entire machete killer case. Part 4. Camilla's letter. Paul, I'm sorry I went away. I woke up and you weren't there, but someone else was. I should have felt some sort of panic. Maybe called out for you. I could hear you walking around downstairs, rummaging through the fridge. I couldn't move, though. It was as though 100 tiny pins were holding me in place, gently prickling my spine, but I wasn't afraid. All I could think was how much the girl sitting at the foot of the bed looked like me. We had the same eyes, nose. Even her thumbnails were short and stubby like mine. She was much younger, however, a teenager. Her face was alive with emotion, tears pooling in her eyes. The way she looked at me with so much silent affection made me feel like a child who had just learned to tie their shoelaces. It's going to sound so strange, but something inside my head clicked in place and I knew who she was. Mom, I mouthed, not quite able to produce a sound. I never talk about my adoption, and most people would never guess how often I've lain awake, staring at the ceiling just wondering who she had been, where she had gone. I suppose all adopted kids secretly hope there is a justifiable reason for being denied the love and care of the person who made us. Still, there was no relief in knowing my biological mother was dead. Again, I can't even begin to explain how I knew this to be true, but I did. Downstairs, I heard one of the doors slam as you went outside, and the girl reached for my hand. The moment my mother's soft, pale skin grazed mine, the bedroom disappeared. Within the blink of an eye, I was no longer sitting on bedsheets, but a knitted blanket on the ground beside a lake in the woods. Despite the fog, I felt no chill. Joanna. The woman still sat at my feet, holding my hand. That's what I named you when you were just a bean. What happened? I asked, trying to stifle the emotions bubbling at the back of my throat. I can't blame them for not telling you about it, my mother sighed. I was already 7 months into the pregnancy, though it barely showed. I was only 16 and my parents wanted me to abort or give you up for adoption. So I just packed up and left my hometown behind. My parents had never so much as acknowledged my adoption, though I was the only light-haired member in a giant family of second-wave Italian immigrants. I had tried to ask questions, but they were always met with defensive, guilt-inducing retorts. How could you think that, Camilla? I had no idea where to go or what to do, my mother continued. I was very hormonal when I left home and already seriously doubted I'd be able to keep you and me off the streets. I didn't have much in the way of money, only enough for 3 or 4 more meals. I had hitchhiked my way to an off-road diner. My mother's eyes never left mine as she spoke. Even though the things she was telling me were incredibly sad, there was an air of removal about her, like she was telling the story of someone very distant, a friend of a friend. I still couldn't say anything, not until she finished her story. I took their cheapest meal, some eggs and toast. I refused the coffee because I'd read somewhere it was bad for the baby. I was sitting there trying to come up with a plan, figuring I should get one last ride to the nearest city and find a woman's shelter. I'd be safe there until after the birth. That's when he slid into my booth and introduced himself as Jack. He was not much older than me, early 20s at most. Not handsome by any means, but not bad looking either. He was confident and well-spoken, asking if I was okay. It was a kindness from a stranger and I took to it. Not long after that, I was in his car. I didn't register it at first, that subtle transformation that had taken place when we were no longer in a public place. Jack was no longer cheerful and his voice had lost its softness. It made me uneasy and I stopped making small talk, wishing the city lines would appear. That's when he turned off the main road and into the woods. Though a part of me knew what this meant, a hopeful side tried to ask what he was doing, where he was going. He only roared at me to shut up. He was sweating and agitated, and after maybe 20 minutes of awful bumps and swerves, he stopped the car near a remote wooden shack in the woods. At this point, I knew I was in a lot of trouble and the fear had made me irrational. I jumped out of the car and tried to run. But I was carrying low and every lunge forward felt as though my pelvis would shatter. I got as far as the edge of the woods before he pushed me belly first to the forest floor. The pain of the fall was nothing compared to the horror of knowing he had hurt not only me, but you inside of me. Instead of getting up to run, I rolled over on my back and stopped screaming. I think I even stopped breathing as I waited for you to give me a kick to let me know you were okay. Just as I finally felt your movement, the man grabbed my legs and dragged me back to the shed. I resumed screaming and tried to jerk my legs away by kicking, but he was too strong. He lifted me onto a wooden table, restraining me with rope and shoving rags in my mouth so I wouldn't scream. I struggled to breathe through just my nose, which was filling up with mucus because I was crying. I watched Jack fumble with something in the corner of the shed. He didn't say a word, but I could see he was tense. I wished I could talk to him, plead with him to spare me, spare us. He didn't look as though he wanted to go through with it. When he turned around, I saw that he had a butcher's knife in his hands. He held it awkwardly as he stepped forward, then hesitated, then came up to my head. Every time I tried to scream, the rag in my mouth seemed to suck more air in from my lungs. Then, he brought down the knife and the right side of my head erupted in pain. Through water-filled eyes, I saw him holding my bloody ear in his left hand, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched me writhe in agony. That's when a different, all-encompassing pain exploded in my midsection. It was my first contraction, and it was enough for the water to break and spill out of me, pooling between my legs before running down the sides of the table. A look of horror crossed the man's face, and he set aside the knife. He ripped open my blouse and stared at my hardened belly. You were kicking, and when he saw one of your legs jab at my belly button, he cursed. He began pacing the shed, muttering something to himself and running his hands through his hair, and I could see large, dark sweat stains on the underarms of his sweater. The second contraction combined with my limited air supply and steady blood loss knocked me out cold. The third brought me back, and I saw that I was no longer in the shed, but in the back of the car with the rag still in my mouth. My body was in shivers, and my eyes couldn't focus. I wasn't sure if it was the fall, ear removal, or something else, but I knew then that I was dying. The next and final time I came to, I saw a woman and felt water being splashed on my face. Cars zoomed past, and the woman was shouting something. I let go then, knowing you were safe, allowing myself to slip into the sweet unconsciousness of death. Once I was removed from the tortures of the physical world, I watched them load my limp body into an ambulance, where the paramedics performed an emergency C-section to get you out. I could tell by their faces they didn't think you would live, but you were a fighter. I wanted so much to go with you, to make sure they took care of you in the hospital, but I couldn't. Not long after the ambulance drove off, I was back inside the shed, watching the man who claimed to be Jack sitting in a corner, crying. Ever since then, I've been trapped in these woods, never making it far from the shed. The man was gone for a long time, and I think he moved away after what he did to me. It's hard to tell how much time passes in these woods, but when he came back with another girl, he was at least 20 years older and entirely cool and collected. After his return, girl after girl died in the shed, joining me in the woods. We all look the same, and we all feel the same things. We spend our days walking this forest, mourning our lost lives, wishing to see our loved ones out in the world of the living. But we can't leave and we can't rest. Not until the man who did this to us continues to roam free, eyeing his next victim. After my mother had finished her story, we sat in silence for a long time. I had so many questions, but I couldn't quite phrase a single one of them. After a while, my mother asked me about my life. So I've been telling her, little by little. It was more of a dialogue when I told her about my childhood and teenage years, since my mother would keep interrupting, wanting to know if my favorite ice cream had been mint chip, like hers, or if I had liked drawing as she had done. It's been a little sad since I've caught up to the adult years. She just listens, but she has nothing to compare it to since she essentially died a child. When we are not talking, she watches me paint. Sometimes she will sketch with me, and I can see that had she pursued the talent, she would have grown into a great artist. Paul, I felt you in the woods the other night. I felt you dying and wanted to help you, but no matter which way I ran, your cries grew more distant. I begged my mother to take me to you, but she just shook her head, suddenly serious. Your husband is the only one that can help us, she said. He got it wrong once, but he won't this time. I believe in him. Paul, I held my breath as you teetered on the brink between life and death, and cried with relief when I felt you safe again. I've passed along this letter in hopes that it will find you. I don't know if you feel it, but I do. I think the girls here feel it too. The trees are abuzz with it. The water ripples. Carry it onto the shore of the lake. We're nearing the pinnacle of whatever this entire journey has been about. There's a reason we ended up in these woods. And it wasn't just our constant quarrels over the past few weeks. In a twisted way, this entire thing started with me, or more precisely my biological mother, Leanne Somerson, dying 32 years ago on the day of my birth. It started with me, Paul, but it can only end with you. I love you. Camilla. I read the pages of Camilla's letter over and over until sunrise, stopping only to wind up the flashlight. Eventually, I tucked the letter away into one of the pockets of Uncle Johnny's jacket and started making my way back to the cabin. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and leaves ruffling in the wind. Combined, the noises sounded like a consistent low hum, almost a cheer. The woods were egging me on, sending me off on a mission, but also eagerly anticipating my return. Could I pull off what they were asking? I had already been mistaken once. This new information about the machete killer's timeline had just blown the case wide open. How did the investigators and my team get it so wrong with Henry Briarwood? The true unsub's reign of terror had spanned decades and probably involved several different states. Both his MO and signature had evolved over the years. And I wouldn't be surprised if this guy staged the bodies in trees not as an act of some sick, twisted fantasy, but as a distraction. Henry Briarwood had been tried on 5 counts of murder and suspected of maybe another 2 victims. There had been far fewer women in that clearing. Some were skeletal, which probably meant their remains had never been found. I had no choice. I would have to leave Fever Cabin and go back to the city to access the full case files and process the suspect list from scratch.